Hello everyone. Today is May 9th, 2021. There's the scenery. Not much to see. Rain and a brick wall. So, enough with the scenery. So, I want to make this video. This is going to be challenging. But I want to make this video to ask a few questions. To try and provoke some thought. Now, and I also obviously want to try and answer these questions. The first question is, what if the place that was reorganized and proposed for nationhood in 1948, that is known as now the Nation of Israel, in what we call the Middle East, and its location is at 33 latitude and 33 longitude. Now that's a thought. What if that place doesn't get any more specific than that? Now we know that's the lowest spot on earth, supposedly. The Dead Sea is the location of the lowest land place that's known that's below sea level. Anyway, what if that place, that place that was given nationhood by a decree of the United Nations in 1948, what if that place was not done by God in fulfillment of the scriptures, of the writings of the holy promises in the prophets? What if that were the case? What if the reorganization of that country and the naming of it as Israel were something done by the will of man and not by the will of God? Remember the father Abraham, the father of Isaac and Jacob, and then Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, who inherited the promise that God gave to Abraham to be planted in that land and his descendants forever, to give it to them for an inheritance. Remember him, Abraham. He was called out of Ur, the land of the Chaldees. Chaldeans, doesn't that sound familiar? Babylon. Abraham was originally called out of the area of Babylon to go to the land known as the land of the Canaanites, to replace them. But not in his lifetime. He walked in it as a stranger, as a pilgrim, wandering as a nomad. And it was promised to be given to his children after, or his descendants, we would say, after a period of bondage, after a period of slavery that they would endure in the land of Egypt. After that time, God would deliver them from the slavery, take them back on a journey, being led specifically by him back to that land, and they would supernaturally defeat the people that occupied the land because of the idolatry of those people. And that God would establish his way of government. God would establish his prototype of how he wanted men to live in the earth. Laws and statutes. He told Abraham, instruct your children in these things, and tell them about me, tell them of my ways, and to follow me and to look for me and to look to me, and I will lead them and teach them everything they need to know. So sure enough, God did raise up a deliverer after 430 years of bondage there in Egypt, and they were brought out. So God fulfilled that promise that he made to Abraham. And through Moses, he told those people, those descendants of Abraham, that if they kept the law that God gave them through Moses, he brought them out through Moses, and God gave them a law through Moses, that if they would keep the law of Moses, he would bless them and cause them to flourish there. But if they left those commandments and failed to keep them, and they went after the ways of the people that were there before them, to serve other God, the sun, the moon, and the stars, and creeping things and everything else you can think of, that he would destroy them. He would do exactly to them what he did to the people who they replaced. And sure enough, that very exact thing happened about 900 years after they settled in the land. They were expelled because, according to God in the prophets, he said that these people did worse things than even Sodom and Gomorrah. That they did worse things than the heathens that God had driven out and caused them to take their place. So God being who he is, and just and righteous, he had to do to them the same thing that he did to the people who they replaced. So, what if that state that sits over there, now we know this was thousands of years ago, but what if that place that sits over there in that land that has been redesignated by man as 3333, if you want to find it in the crosshairs of your latitude and longitudinal system of GPS, there it is. So what if that place is not something that is of God in the way of a promise and a promise kept, but what if that place is done or has been set up by the will of man? What if, in the same way that God promised Abraham, who was married to a woman that was barren, and he only had her as a wife, he was the husband of one wife, and so God promised him that he had this promise of what was going to happen to his numerous descendants, that they would be like the stars of the sky, which isn't that impressive today if you live in the city, because you may see one star in the sky or none. But if we could actually see the sky the way it is, without the pollution of man, light pollution and otherwise, you would see that there's a scary amount of stars in the sky. so that they could be compared to grains of sand on the sea, on the beach. Numerous, 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 numerous. Too many to count. So he was promised that he would have this multitude of descendants that he would never even be able to count. Innumerable descendants. So he knows that his wife is barren. She knows that she's barren, and they've gotten old and haven't had any children. So here's this promise that lays in front of them. And they're anxious for the promise. So what does Sarah do? Sarah goes to Abraham and says, Abraham, take this bondwoman, because Sarah had an Egyptian servant named Hagar, who was young, and they would assume that she would be fertile. So she said, here, go take her as a second wife, as a concubine. And, God made a promise. Maybe this is the way he'll fulfill the promise. So they did that. She went in. Abraham went in unto her, and sure enough, Hagar, the Egyptian servant, she conceived. Now, this was not the will of God, as the Bible later goes on to explain. This was by the will of man. And Paul, in the brilliance and the spiritual insight of his writings, explains to us how this comes to represent the Old and the New Testament, and the law versus the gospel and the salvation of God through faith in Jesus, through his son, the new and better covenant. He says that Hagar's son, Ishmael, was not the promised seed. And thus, him and his mother were cast out because there was trouble. He was a mocker of the promised one. The mother, Hagar, of Ishmael, she became smug and arrogant and despised Sarah, her mistress. When she saw that she had conceived. She saw that she was pregnant. So she thought that she was going to take Sarah's place as the favored wife. I guess she was going to try and be a supplanter. So anyway, Paul goes on to say that this child, Ishmael, that was born of the desperate schemings of Sarah, and Abraham giving into it, and Hagar, this scheme of these three people, he was born by the will of man. This was not God's will. And when it came time that the decision had to be made that the boy should be cast out because he was not the promised seed, God made a promise of a seed to Abraham. And Ishmael was not it. He said, Sarah will bear this child unto you, born by the will of God. That's that state over there in Israel. God is going to place his name in that land again, but not by the will of man.